Welcome to Compass Points, the weekly podcast for CompassKnox.com. CompassKnox.com is your best source for news and politics in Knoxville and Knox County. Your hosts today are Scott Barker and Jesse Mayshark, the founders of CompassKnox.com. You can find their daily in-depth coverage and subscribe at CompassKnox.com. The Compass Point podcast is brought to you in conjunction with Almost an Agreement. Almost an Agreement is a layman's attempt to get a handle on the workings in government and politics that we deal with every day. Check them out at almostanagreement.com or subscribe for free on your favorite podcast provider. If you'd like to learn more about the topics discussed on today's podcast, go to CompassKnox.com and subscribe for in-depth coverage and much more. And now, here are your hosts, Scott and Jesse from CompassKnox.com.
Hello and welcome again to Compass Points, the weekly podcast where we talk about Knoxville news, government, politics, education, business, really whatever gets our attention. I'm Jesse Mayshark, co-founder and co-publisher of Compass at CompassKnox.com, which covers all of the above. Joined, as always, by Scott Barker, also co-publisher and co-founder of Compass. How are you doing on this May Day, Scott?
Doing fine, especially since we're heading into a long weekend.
We are indeed.
So that's always nice to have that extra day.
Quasi-official kickoff to summer. Of course, Knox County schools ended this past week. Memorial Day weekend is when a lot of summer things start happening. Our public pools are opening up, and there's various outdoor activities going on this weekend. And of course, it is Memorial Day weekend, so there is a solemn occasion around which all of this festivity occurs. So we certainly wish the best to everybody on this weekend. And also, Scott, the entry into summer often kind of marks a bit of a slowdown in some of the things that we cover regularly. We're getting toward the end of budget season for our local governments, and obviously schools are out, and a lot of things just slow down a bit in the summer. We're going to talk about budget issues somewhat this week. We also had an interesting power poll, which is something we do every month, a poll of community leaders in Knoxville, giving their thoughts this time about the pro-Palestinian protests and the ways that our various institutions have responded to them. Some follow-up on a story we reported last fall about sort of ongoing tensions and dialogue around Three Rivers Market, the food co-op in North Knoxville. They had an unwelcome finding from a state health inspector. We'll talk about that a little bit. Graduate student workers at the University of Tennessee are organized and petitioning for better pay, basically. We'll talk about that a little bit and how it's part of a broader trend across the country. And so to start off, though, we will talk about the Knox County budget, because we have one now. County Commission last week approved County Mayor Glenn Jacobs' proposed budget, which we have talked about in previous weeks. It is a quite lean $1.08 billion, if there is such a thing as a lean $1 billion, just up about 3% from the current year, and most of that increase is in the school funding. The funding for county operations apart from schools is pretty close to flat, and in fact, depending on how you do the math, it's less than flat, because the county employees, so we talked about school employees are getting good size raises this coming year, which has to do with the school board's adoption of a new salary schedule, enabled to a large degree by the increases in state funding they've had over the past few years under the state's new education funding formula. And that accounts for about 2/3 of the county budget. And the school workforce is in the vicinity of 8,000 people. It's by far the largest county, the bulk of county employees. But everybody else who works for the county, and that's the sheriff's office, and then everybody who's under County Mayor Glenn Jacobs in the Parks and Rec Department, libraries, Public Works, Health Department, all of those. All of those employees are receiving, well, the way it was presented is they're receiving a 2% raise, but that 2% raise doesn't actually start until January, halfway through the fiscal year. So functionally, for the 24-25 fiscal year, they're really getting a 1% raise. And while inflation has come down, it's still running somewhere between 3 and 3.5%. And so if you assume that that's going to continue to be the case for the next year, then only getting a 1% raise is functionally a pay cut.
Yes.
That's how that works. And so County Sheriff Tom Spangler made a last-ditch effort at last Monday's County Commission meeting to try to get a little bit better deal for his employees, which is not a surprise. Spangler has been a strong advocate the whole time he's been sheriff for increasing compensation for his staff. And last year, people might remember, he scored really quite a victory by somewhat threatening, in a diplomatic way, but to take the county to court if he didn't get better raises. And he worked out a deal with Jacobs last year that significantly boosted the starting pay for both deputies and corrections officers in the county jail up above $50,000 a year each. And for corrections officers in particular, that was a huge jump because they were around $39,000. So they got a big jump this current year. And that jump in the deputies' pay took them, unusually for the sheriff's office, past the minimum pay for the Knoxville Police Department. Like, over most of their histories, the police department has typically paid a bit more than the sheriff's office, and the sheriff's office is always trying to play catch up with them, but they went ahead of them this year. Well, so that's not going to last long, because City Mayor India Kincannon has proposed a sizable increase for KPD for their starting salaries this year, boosting them up to $56,000 a year, whereas in the coming year in the county budget, sheriff's deputies will be making about $52,000. And so Spangler did come to commission and, just made a very strong emotional appeal, basically saying that, first of all, they needed to try to stay competitive with KPD. He said that the increases have really helped put a dent in the number of vacancies that they had at the sheriff's office. Like, they seem like they went from like 190 vacancies to 35. Like, they were able to attract more people, and he said that higher pay was the biggest reason. But he also just made that, as he typically does when he's talking about his officers, this very emotional case that these are men and women who go out every day and face the uncertainties of law enforcement, which certainly can be dangerous. And to sort of really emphasize that point, he actually had with him at the podium Katerina Blakely, who's the widow of Sheriff's Officer Tucker Blakely, who people may remember was killed last fall while responding to a domestic violence call. It's the first officer the sheriff's office has actually had die in the line of duty in like 40 years, but a stark reminder that, yes, it certainly can be a dangerous job. And Spangler himself, I think it's worth noting, presented a sympathetic figure personally, because this was the first time that he's been back to talk to county commission since he disclosed in February that he's being treated for pancreatic cancer. And you could see the effects of his treatment. He showed up with no hair, and, he kind of made reference to that he's been struggling, and he really appreciated everything, the support and well wishes and prayers that he's gotten from county commission. But that in and of itself was not enough to change anything in the budget. A couple of commissioners, Commissioner Larson J., who's been a strong supporter over the years of increasing sheriff's pay, and also, it's worth noting, is running for county mayor in 2 years, and so probably wants to be perceived as being a supporter of the sheriff's office, because that often helps people who are running for county mayor. he really kind of got down to brass tacks with Chief Financial Officer Chris Caldwell and said, what about this? What about that? Right? Like, basically, is there a way we can do this? And Caldwell pretty much held the line and just said, no. We're looking at, and we talked last week about the county's increasing debt burden over the coming years. We talked about their flattening sales tax revenue. Their property tax revenues are, between 1 and 2% growth per year. So he basically just said what we're anticipating, the levels of revenue we're anticipating means that there is not basically what Spangler was asking for was just for the 400 uniformed deputies, just for them, if they could boost the pay, get it up equal with KPD, which was going to cost about $1.5 million, which in a $1 billion budget doesn't sound like very much money. And that was a point that Jay made. And Caldwell said, well, right, like in the context of the whole budget, it's not a lot. But if you go into that budget and start looking to see where you can find $1.5 million, it's not there. And so the upshot of it was that Jay promised that in August, he chairs the commission's finance committee, and that in August, when they get their year-end numbers from the current year, the 23-24 fiscal year, if there's any wiggle room there, if there's more money left over than Caldwell's anticipating, then maybe they could use that to do some kind of adjustment, whether it's a pay increase or a bonus or something. And Caldwell basically said, sure, we can look at that in August. So that was the best Spangler got, which, given the success he's had in past years of making these appeals, besides last year, there was a previous year where he made a last-ditch appeal like this and got, a $1,500 bonus for all of his employees that year. And I think if commissioners felt like there was any money to give, any room to play with, they probably would have been sympathetic. But the fact that they didn't, I think, just goes to reinforce how tight this county budget is.
Yeah, they're, it's really, interesting, especially in light of the debt discussion that they had previous week when I think that might have scared some of them because that was a pretty bleak report on the debt that Chris Caldwell gave them, and they, and they're kind of stuck because nobody, on that at least nobody wants to raise taxes, and it's obvious that growth alone is not going to significantly increase revenues. So that's what. You get a lean budget when that happens.
Yeah, and there was some interesting discussion. County Commissioner Kyle Ward, who is not running for re-election this year, and so he kind of said, I'm out of here in 3 months, and so I can say what I think. And he did not come out and call for a tax increase or anything, but he basically just said, our revenue situation is not sustainable. Like what we've been doing for the last 25 years, it's been 25 years since the county raised property taxes, has been relying on what they call natural growth. Of course, there's no such thing as natural growth, but what they mean by natural growth is the growth that happens year after year with development of new property development, which raises property values, which increases the tax base, which does, has helped sustain that sort of like 1 to 2% growth overall in property tax revenues, which is not huge, a 1 to 2% growth, but it is growth. But that the needs of the county are outstripping what that provides, basically. And there's been a lot of discussion about this, including during the Advanced Knox planning process that the county just went through, of the fact that growth does not, well, it depends on the kind of growth, but a lot of growth, and especially the kind of growth the county's been seeing, which is single-family development of subdivisions farther and farther out into more rural areas of the county, it really doesn't pay for itself. It does increase your tax base, but with that, you bring a whole bunch of people who then have needs, whether those are, for county roads that probably need improvement and widening and traffic signals and all of those things that you get when you get more traffic, for schools and parks and amenity, all of the different things that government provides. And the growth just is not keeping up with that. And so, again, right, Ward did not call for a tax increase. Jay, who is running for county mayor, who has often talked about, the sort of difficult situation of county revenue, he is not right now anyway calling for a tax increase. But there is a growing and partly I think it's because nobody expects that Jacobs, who has 2 years left and also most people think is running for governor in 2026, is, he's just like not going to call for a tax increase. Nope. Philosophically or politically, like that's just not going to happen in the next couple of years. So nobody is going to go out there right now and call for it. But there is a lot of talk on commission. There's talk among people who are running for commission this year and other people in the community just kind of saying, like at a certain point, you may need to look at what levers you have to deal with this, because they do have levers, and those levers have to do with taxes. However much they might resist talking about it, past a certain point, if people want services, then you have to go to people and say, well, if you want those services, then how much are you willing to pay for them?
Right. Yeah. Property taxes, of course, are the primary method of doing it, but there's wiggle room in the sales tax.
There is.
Cap too. There's I think another half cent that can that it could go up but voters would have to approve that.
Right, and that would be a whole issue of having to, then you have to go out and sort of like really push for a referendum to try to get the general public to vote for a tax increase, which has happened in the past. But.
Yeah, I'm going to interrupt with a question, guys, because on my show we were talking a little bit about some of this stuff last week, and Sam, my co-host, had mentioned something about, with the Smokies coming to Knoxville and like Sevier County is known for their tourism tax. Is that an option that's at play for Knox County to tack on to, change the hotel tax, something in that market?
I don't actually know how Sevier County's taxes are configured, but I think, they make most of their money on just straight sales taxes and hotel motel taxes, because they have a tremendous sales tax base in Sevier County. Sevier County has one of the lower property tax rates around because they just generate so much money from that. So, we do functionally have tourism taxes in our hotel motel taxes. That's basically what those are. But I don't think anybody's really anticipating the Smokies in particular are going to do a lot for our hotel motel taxes, because most people who go to the Smokies games are going to be people who live here and going to come down to they'll spend money. Everybody anticipates it's going to help with sales tax increases, but those sales tax increases, at least in the immediate vicinity of the stadium, are already budgeted to pay for the stadium. That doesn't by itself generate probably enough to make much of a difference. Certainly not to the county, because also the stadium is in the city, and the county doesn't get any sales taxes at all from anything that happens within city limits. And so that's the other challenge that the county has. Like if you talk about increasing the sales tax, which if people approve that, if you went up that extra half cent, it would generate more money. But first of all, almost 72.5%. We're going to be really specific of sales taxes generated in the city and the county, except for in the town of Farragut, goes straight to the school system. And so the county general budget wouldn't get a lot of that. Now you could say, oh, well, if the school system's getting more, they could, spend some of their other money. You could move some things around. But the bigger problem the county has with sales tax is most sales tax is generated in the city and in Farragut. The county gets somewhere in the vicinity of a quarter of all sales taxes in the county. And so even raising the sales tax is probably, it would generate something, but it's probably not going to be some huge windfall, even if they could navigate the politics of it. Sure. So I'm sure we will hear more about all of that in future years, but for now, the county has a budget. It's passed, it's approved, and we can put that one to rest. Scott, our intern, Owen McCarthy, who we introduced here last week, wrote an interesting story for us this week about graduate student workers at the University of Tennessee seeking better pay and working conditions. So what's going on with that?
Well, the graduate workers, and we're talking teaching assistants and research assistants, and for those who don't know, most people do, I think, but don't know, when you go to graduate school, one of the ways you help pay for your graduate school is being a teaching assistant or a research assistant. And these workers want more money and better benefits, and they've organized they've organized a committee, circulated a petition with more than 700 signatures, and they're actually building on some improvements that were made this academic year that's ending soon. Their annual stipend for doing this went from $14,400 for all these workers to $19,400 for people on a 9-month contract, which are basically teaching assistants, and almost $26,000 for those on a 12-month contract. And those are mostly the research assistants. And there's that one of the organizers talked about that being a 2-tiered system, and they would like to see the stipend raised to at least $30,000 a year for all of these workers. And one of their arguments is like the teaching assistants on a 9-month contract make less money, but they also have to, even though you're a teaching assistant, you still have your own research you're doing, and so they've got to do that year round. It's not anything where they actually take a 3-month vacation. So so they want to raise the pay there. They also want some tweaks to the benefits. One of the things is if you have to go on take a leave of absence, you lose your health insurance, and so they're wanting to change that. And so they've circulated this petition. They've presented it to Chancellor Donde Plowman. Ball's in her court now. The UT officials said that they're going to be looking at it, but they didn't, and will be responding at some point. Who knows when? Maybe they'll hope people forget about it over the summer. But
and they made the point that they did just raise them to the levels you're talking about. That they did actually get a raise this year. Yeah. Yeah,
but it's kind of interesting because in Tennessee being a right to work state and has traditionally been it's been not a very fertile place for unions and collective bargaining.
Actively hostile, I think, is the way to, our governor and several of our state leaders just tried really hard to stop the VW plant in Chattanooga from organizing.
Yeah, well, that was what I was going to get to, is the VW plant organized in Chattanooga. And yeah, you're right. The governor basically said if the union organizes there, the state is going to fall apart. Well, that hasn't happened,
more or less. Yeah.
but it's and graduate students all across the country are doing these kinds of things to try to get together and organize and try to get better pay and it can be tough as a graduate student as well, because you do have you have your classes, you have your whatever your duties as a research assistant or a teaching assistant, and you're not 18 years old anymore. You're in your late 20s, early 30s. People are having families. People are it's not but it's always been a source of cheap labor for universities, and they think that they deserve more.
Yeah, and I think that part of that is arguing to reframe what they do as labor, because I think the way a lot of people outside academia probably think of it is, they get their schooling paid for, because that's part of the deal. You when you have an assistantship, you're not paying tuition, which is true. But not paying tuition doesn't give you money for groceries and all those things, which is why they always have gotten some stipends. Mm-hmm. But if you look at the levels that you're talking about as somebody's salary to live on, like it's not very much money. I have experienced myself in the past. I was part of a household that was surviving on a journalist's salary and a graduate student assistantship between the two of us. And let me tell you, that was not a lot of money.
Did you supplement by shoplifting or anything like that?
No, we did not do that. But there were a lot of things we didn't do because we couldn't afford to do them. A lot of things we didn't buy because we couldn't afford to buy them. And so I think that really realizing that, yes, they are getting the benefit of studying at, a university and of eventually receiving an advanced degree that will help them in their career down the line. Sure, true. But in the short term, while they're there, they are actually working. They're teaching classes, which the university needs people to do, and teaching, like they're called teaching assistantships. That's what they're doing. They're teaching classes. I had classes at Penn State taught by TAs.
I had them as well. They, when you take freshman English, you're probably going to be taught by a TA.
Right.
So,
and then the research assistants also are doing work, and they're doing work for professors who are conducting their own research to further their own careers and, boost the standing of the university and so forth.
Right.
But that's work that's being, and again, you can say, well, they're getting experience, which will help them in their career. True. But as any intern can tell you who's had an unpaid internship, you can't eat on experience either. And so it's not that the university is not providing value in the academic work that these graduate students get to do. But the students, the workers, are providing value to the university too. And basically they're saying that work is being undervalued and underpaid. And, it's kind of interesting to think about it side by side with student athletes, because that's basically the same argument that student athletes have made in pushing for the name, image, likeness revenues that they're at least allowed to get now, but that they also bring value to the university that they believe has been undervalued.
Yeah, and just we're taping this on Friday. Just last night, there was a settlement in a lawsuit where I don't remember the exact dollar amount. It's a couple of $1 billion that is basically going to pave the way for athletes to be paid as employees or similar to the way employees are. The NCAAs and member institutions don't want to call them employees at all. They have a problem, they will begrudgingly pay them if they don't want to call them employees.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's a very similar thing as, these graduate students, they're not bringing 100,000 people to Neyland Stadium, but they are performing, valuable work for the university.
Yep. Well, I'm sure we will hear more about this as it goes forward, and we'll also probably at some point be following up on the implications of that NCAA situation, because I was just thinking about, graduate students around the country in many places have unionized, and they have been allowed to unionize by the National Labor Relations Board. It has recognized their right to do that. And I was just thinking, what a nightmare a players union, a college athletes union would be for university officials.
They have ruled that Dartmouth University, Ivy League school, that their athletes can organize them, recognize their so they've got a union already. So
could be some interesting things.
It's all a patch
down the road.
It's all a weird patchwork of stuff. You got to, it would be, all the different lawsuits, all the different things over, surrounding college sports is it's very complex. There's a lot of moving parts. There's state laws that get involved. There are different state laws. It's just it's a real mess that they're trying to deal with, and we would need a pretty big staff to even just tackle that one.
Yep. All right. Well, interesting stuff.
No pun intended.
On a smaller part part of the landscape, but one that a lot of people and probably a lot of Compass readers care about. Three Rivers Market, the food co-op in North Knoxville, as I mentioned earlier, they had a bad report from the State Department of Agriculture. This is 2 weeks ago now. The Department of Agriculture does regular inspections of retail food outlets all over the state, and they basically inspect if a store sells food, Department of Agriculture shows up and takes a look at it on a regular basis, and that can be anything from a convenience store to a big grocery store to a more, I don't know if you want to call it a boutique or whatever, but a place like the food co-op. And the inspector gave them a 63 out of 100, which you might gather is not a great score. Any score under 70 requires immediate remediation and reinspection. And so they actually got shut down. And from everybody I've talked to, the food co-op's been around in various forms for 43 years now. A lot of people may remember when it was in its longtime location on North Broadway and kind of an old house there, which frankly always seemed a little bit grimy. And that was always maybe a little bit of the appeal.
Yeah, it was kind of the charm.
Yeah. But even there, as far as anybody I've talked to knows, and I've talked to people whose experiences go back decades, it was never shut down by the state. Well, now they're in a much bigger and fairly, shinier store that they opened there in North Knoxville, just in the Happy Hollow area on Central Street, about 12 or 15 years ago. I don't remember exactly how long it's been there.
Yeah.
But they failed this inspection. They got shut down, and the most notable there were several findings. The kinds of findings you often find in these reports can sound fairly minor, like, the temperature of food in the cooler is not quite right, or in one case this time something was being thawed inappropriately, because there are ways that you're supposed to thaw food and ways that you're not. But the things that really jumped out here had to do with rodents, and basically they found a fairly sizable sounding rodent infestation with chew marks on a lot of the bags of rice and grains or along the lower shelves in the co-op, feces kind of everywhere, and then also signs that the store was at least somewhat aware of this problem, because they found a lot of dead rodents, but they were all there were 6 or 7 dead mice lying on one of those sticky traps in or near the meat area, just lying there, which is not, people may have their own feelings about sticky traps themselves. They're a fairly cruel way of trapping mice. I've done it. I don't really recommend it. If you can make snap traps work for you, I think those are a lot more pleasant to deal with. But regardless, whatever kind of trap you use, you're not supposed to leave the dead bodies lying around.
No.
And when you've got 6 or 7 of them lying throughout the store, the inspector flagged all that. Now, the store called in their pest control service to do a special remediation, and they did locate a couple of what they think were major entry points for the rodents and plugged those, and said, they did get it all cleaned up and they were allowed to reopen the next day. And the general manager sent out an email to members of the co-op, and the co-op is member owned, so the members, of which, full disclosure, I'm a member. Lots of people who shop at the co-op are members. Members are the technical legal owners of the store. As a member, you get a little share in the store's ownership. And he did send out an email explaining what had happened, saying, yes, they'd failed this inspection. Here were the findings, and here's what they'd done about it. But that email came 3 days after the closure. It came 2 days after the health report, which was immediately put up on the state's website. So the inspector's report was circulating on social media for 2 days before that email went out. The store's initial communication about this on their Facebook page was just, we're closing for emergency maintenance. We'll be open soon. And then when they reopened, they said, okay, we're back open. They didn't say anything about the reason for the closure. And if you are not a member, and about half, based on what I've been told by co-op people, about half of the shoppers there are members and about half aren't. So if you're in the half of shoppers who go there regularly but you're not a member, you didn't get that email. And those initial statements on their social media remain to this day, or at least yesterday, last time I looked at them, the only official statements the store has made about it, which, you could say not fully candid disclosure about what was actually going on. And you could say, well, do you expect any store to come out and say they failed an inspection? Maybe not. But this is in the context of, and we talked about this a bit last fall when we wrote about it then, this ongoing discussion about the management of the co-op, basically since their longtime general manager, Jacqueline Arthur, retired a few years ago. There has been kind of a growing chorus of dissatisfaction from some employees and some who are now former employees, from many members, some vendors, people who have just basically raised a lot of concerns that the current management is maybe not fully committed to the cooperative philosophy and principles that underlie the store, that the store is supposed to be more than just another grocery store. It's supposed to have responsibilities to the community. It's supposed to have responsibilities to its employees, and certainly to its members, who are its owners. It's in a bit of a complicated situation because it's technically, it's run by a board of directors who are all members who are elected by the members. They have elections on regular cycles. But their only real authority is to hire the general manager. Once the general manager is hired, there are basically rules built into the board's bylaws that really restrict them from much real engagement in the operations of the store. Now, I think that was put in place deliberately under the previous general manager for the reasons that you can envision, which is that if you're trying to run a sizable and somewhat complex operation like that, the last thing you want is a bunch of part-time board members, trying to tell you what brands you should carry, or trying to get jobs for family members, or any of that kind of stuff. Like it's put in there to protect the general manager so that they can run the store. But the sort of challenge it presents is if concerns get raised about the operations of the store, which are under the direction of the general manager, all of those concerns have to go to the general manager. They can be presented to the board, and over the last year, many people, sort of a growing number of people, have been coming to the board at their regular meetings and through other venues, raising concerns. But the board doesn't have, they can go and talk to the general manager about it and say, hey, what are you doing about this? But they don't really have any levers. They could theoretically fire a general manager, but they don't have a lot of ways to engage directly in concerns about the operation. And so that among the concerns that have been raised is that as concerns have been raised to the general manager, they've been ignored, downplayed, and or people who have raised those concerns have suffered retaliation in various ways. And we've reported on some of that. And so this inspection and closure coming in the midst of all of that kind of ongoing dialogue, I think will probably just heighten some of those concerns. There is a group, a member-led group called Three Rivers Revival that is out there encouraging people to get involved. Their kind of argument is that, look, if there are concerns, if there are problems with the co-op, then it's up to the members who actually own it to make their voices heard, to get more engaged, get more involved, exert whatever advocacy or pressure they can on the board and or on the store itself about what they want to see there. So that effort probably got, the people involved with Three Rivers Revival, and we interviewed one of them in our story about this week, say that people involved with co-op leadership, their kind of line on a lot of this has been, these people are trying to destroy the co-op. That's been their sort of somewhat I would say, knee-jerk defensive reaction is all of these voices out there raising concerns. They're harming the co-op. They're trying to harm the co-op. The people involved with Three Rivers Revival say, no, we want to, quote unquote, save the co-op. And that their concern is that if things there don't improve, that it's going to get into a spiral of bad things happening financially and otherwise at the store. So, who knows how all this shakes out? The internal politics of food co-ops, I'm sure, are very complicated everywhere. One can sort of imagine. Co-ops tend to attract shoppers and members who are looking for more than just a grocery store. They're looking for a place that has certain values around the kinds of food they stock, and maybe around the way they treat their vendors and the way they treat their employees and so forth. So I don't know where all of that's going to go, but I do think that this inspection is kind of heightening a lot of that sense of alarm among some people.
Yeah, one thing too with the co-op, because it is more than just a store, there are these other priorities that sometimes compete. Some people value one priority more than another, perhaps, or but somebody else might do the opposite. And a regular grocery store, there's one priority: it's making money for your stockholders. I mean, that's it. That's the only priority. With co-ops, it's much more complicated. It's not just a matter of making enough money to pay the bills.
Right. They do need to do that. And
yes.
So obviously management
that is a priority.
very important to that. And you could argue that even if your concern is only making enough money to keep the store open, having a forced closure for a failed health inspection is probably not great for your business or your reputation. But right, there is also this sense that it's supposed to be about more. It's supposed to represent more. I think one of the challenges for a lot of longtime co-op members and shoppers in trying to suss out what to think about these concerns that have been raised is that people want to feel good about shopping at the co-op. They like shopping at the co-op because they like the things they buy there, they like what they carry and so forth, but they also, there's an intangible that comes with it that you feel a little bit beneficent. You're doing something good. You're doing something not just for yourself, but for the community, because you're supporting this food co-op that supports local vendors and suppliers, that stocks healthy food and so forth. And I think when you hear concerns raised about how a place like the co-op is operating, it creates cognitive dissonance for some people. And the easiest thing in a lot of cases is just to kind of want to be assured that everything's okay so that you can still go there and buy your oat milk and whatever else, your organic greens. So I think you're kind of seeing that play out in some of the online discussion about all of this, is members just really wrestling with how do I think about this? How much do I really want to get engaged in all of this? And so again, this is another thing that I think this discussion is going to be ongoing. The board of directors in recent months, I think it's important to say, I think has made some real efforts. They've created 5 different committees to address some of the concerns that have been raised about engagement with members and about providing voices for employees and those kinds of things. The concern from the Three Rivers Revival people at this point is that those committees just haven't really done much so far. A lot of them have only met once or twice. Unclear how much they really can do under the current management structure. So who knows? But it was an interesting blip on the news radar this past week about a niche operation, but one that I think a lot of people care about. Okay, let's talk about this power poll. We do power polls every month, and I feel like we always have to say the power poll is not our thing exactly. We are the local partners. Compass is the Knoxville partner with Power Poll, which is a broader effort. They run these in, I forget how many cities at this point.
They've grown. I'm not sure how many. Yeah. It started in Nashville.
Right. But well over a dozen cities now. And basically every month, we send out a survey to the people on the power poll. We don't directly choose. So the power poll is made up of community leaders in the public and private sectors, nonprofit sectors, influential people in the community. The idea is to kind of find out what are the elites thinking.
Yeah, the decision makers.
Right.
What are their thoughts on things? So.
And this is not a scientific survey, but it's interesting to just kind of find out what's on the minds of people in decision-making positions in the community. And so this month, Scott, we asked about the recent pro-Palestinian protests and the ways that the University of Tennessee and City of Knoxville have responded to them. And so what did the respondents to the power poll have to say about that?
Well, the respondents to the power poll pretty much are not too enamored of the protests. Apparently, for instance, the University of Tennessee, we had the couple of weeks of protests, not nearly as intense as some of the protests at other schools in the country, like UCLA or Columbia, but there were protests, and it was a group of mostly students. Some people who aren't students were there. They protested in the early part of the month at the law school, in front of the law school, and the UT said you can do that till 10, essentially, and then we're going to arrest you for trespassing if you're still here. And several were, and they arrested like 11 the first night, and then they set aside a place at the student union for protesters to gather during the day into the night till 10 o'clock at night, and the university is allowed to set restrictions on the time and place and the manner of free speech. They can't regulate the content. They have to be content neutral, but they can regulate other things, like you can't do this out till after 10 o'clock. And so all told, I think there were at least 21 people who've been arrested, and that and UT is at the end of the semester, which is a week ago, they shut down that spot that they had set aside for students. I mean, essentially, campus is closed, so there's not a whole lot of activity going on. But we asked the power poll members. It went out to 827 people in the Knoxville area. A little more than a third responded,
which is pretty normal.
Yeah, that's pretty normal. But we asked if you kind of agreed with the way UT responded to that. They did. UT, I will say this: they did engage the protesters and tried to make sure that they understood what policies are, what they could and couldn't do, that sort of thing. And the protesters were nonviolent completely. There was no instance of violence, no incidents of vandalism or anything else like that. A very, very civil thing, except for the arrests. But anyway, we asked if people agreed with their response, and 61% said yes, absolutely. Now 34%, which is the next sizable chunk of respondents, said no, that they didn't agree because the UT should not have arrested nonviolent protesters. And then there were 3% who said that UT should have been tougher. But all told, there was a lot of support for the way that UT has handled these protests. And then and we've talked about this before. kind of protested at city council meetings. And what they've taken to do at city council meetings is several people will sign up to speak on various agenda items, and they'll speak on the agenda item, and they use this as a pretext. A lot of them use artificial intelligence programs to write their speeches for them, and it's which leads to some very strange speeches. But and then at the end, they will shout "ceasefire now," and the supporters in the crowd will respond "ceasefire now." It's right at the end of their time, and they're out of order, but they're also out of time, so they're not going to speak anymore. But the primary purpose it serves is to drag out council meetings. Council members are very frustrated about it, and there's not a whole lot they can do about it, but they can
short of completely changing their rules somehow.
Yeah, that'd be kind of tough. But we also asked if Power Poll members, if they agreed with those tactics, that if they thought, they're still getting their point across and everything. But 82% said nah.
What was the number?
82%.
Didn't support the tactic of...
Yeah, they said it's an abuse of the process.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's, they're only a handful, full 11% said, no harm, no foul, it's not a big deal. But 82%, which is probably as high as just about any question we've ever asked on the Power Poll in the last 3 years or so. And then we also asked if one of the things that they're seeking is a resolution, ceasefire resolution, and two have been proposed in the past by Councilwoman Amelia Parker. Both of them essentially condemned Israel, which did not go over well in the Jewish community, and did not go over well on council. Neither one even got to a vote. So, but but these protesters want some kind of statement on the city's behalf in support of the Palestinian people. Another large majority basically said it's none of the city's business, 74%. So 3/4 of the respondents said, nah, it's not the city's business. Another 12% said, well, maybe, just kind of depends on how the wording goes, which, it's kind of leads you to believe that it will. As long as you don't condemn either side, or you condemn both sides equally, be okay. But anyway, that's the kind of the attitude toward the aims and tactics of the protesters at that city council. And then we also asked a predictive question. We asked, where do these protests go now? Because the war's not over, obviously. In fact, Israel has moved into Rafah. They're intensifying the fighting. The international community is growing very impatient with Israel, and they want them to end this somehow, especially the civilian deaths. The Israel, and these numbers are always taken with a grain of salt,
subject to a lot of debate.
But Israel says like 16,000 were combatants, as they call them, or actually I think Israel called them terrorists, but have died. Hamas fighters essentially have died, and another 14,000 civilians.
Right. So almost 1-to-1.
Yeah.
Even by Israel's own account, that's almost one civilian death for every Hamas death. And so the total's about 30,000. The Ministry of Health in Gaza, which of course is controlled by Hamas, says the number is 35,000. They don't divide them into combatants and non-combatants. They just said these are all Palestinians. So it's a whichever number is correct. If either one of them is correct, and if anything, they're probably a little low.
it's still a lot of people.
Yeah,
a lot of death there. And but we asked what form the protest would take. Of course, one thing you got to remember is UT's closed, so that one's that might end up at least in the short term slacking up a little bit. But 38%, and the respondents were kind of divided on where they thought it would go. About 38% said it kind of lose steam, and another quarter almost said they thought that protests would continue pretty much the way they have been, and only 5% thought that they would intensify, and to the point of possibly violence or anything like that. So everybody's pretty optimistic that whatever they do, it's going to be, continue to be nonviolent.
More of the same or less.
More
basically.
of the same or less. But significantly, of course, 1 in 5 said they were unsure. Of what's going to happen. Of course,
which is a nice, honest answer.
Yes, it is. We like to think. We like to think sometimes that we know what's going to happen before it does, but we don't.
This is correct. Yeah, and of course we did not ask anybody's opinion on the underlying issues in the conflict because we're focused on local issues, and we're even though this is obviously an international issue that is having a lot of local impact. That's what we're talking about, the local impact,
and local response.
Yeah, and so what any of those numbers would mean about people's overall feelings about the war in Gaza, I think it's hard to extrapolate from it.
Yeah, we purposely did not say who do you support in the war.
Yeah,
and
if anybody.
Okay.
Well, as with everything else this week, I guess we'll see. We'll see what happens with those protests over the summer. And next week, we have first of all, we have a short week because it's a holiday week, of course, Memorial Day on Monday, and not a whole lot on the civic calendar, but City Council gets to deal with their budget this week.
Yes, they do. We started out talking about the county budget, and we'll close out talking about the city budget. It's the second reading on the budget. It's a $461 million budget. It's not tied in the sense that the county budget is, but there aren't any huge new initiatives. The big thing is the pay raise for uniformed police officers, which will boost their pay from about starting pay from about $46,000 to $56,000 a year, and all of the pay scales are adjusted accordingly. And and they did that, as Spangler noted, did that to try to stay competitive. And,
right. KPD officers should really thank the county for raising their pay last year because it gave them the opening to because they just got some decent size increases a couple of years ago coming out of the tax increase that got passed. But now they're getting another big jump because of, or at least partly in response to the county increasing their pay. Yeah.
And so far the increase that was passed a couple of years ago, that set it at 46 and prompted the sheriff to raise or to get the lobby to get the pay raised for deputies, is that it hasn't really made especially since the county pay went up, and other agencies in the region have gone up too, and so it's not really made a huge dent in the shortage. If anything, it's not had much of an effect at all
in terms of recruiting new officers.
Right, the police department is still about 66 officers shy of their authorized strength. And they have roughly 70 officers who are ready to retire and could retire at any time. They could file the paperwork on Tuesday, and but the city, they had one of the things that Boyce Evans, the chief financial officer, said was that the the last couple of years, with the combination of things, but primarily the increased sales tax revenues, the city's been able to not really tap into the property tax increase that was passed a couple of years ago. Those revenues they thought would be going to salaries, and they haven't had to go to salaries yet. So it's in fact they revised their forecast on when revenues and expenditures would cross. Right now, revenues are higher than expenditures, so and that's been moved out a couple of years to 2030 because of that. So there's they're not in bad shape. The city isn't, but then again, there's nothing huge in this. One of the big projects they talked about was put a new roof on the Tennessee Amphitheater, World Fair Park.
Right.
Which is expensive, don't get me wrong.
Yeah, but when a new roof out of a 400 and how big is the budget?
$461 million.
Out of a $461 million budget, when a new roof is kind of your biggest expenditure.
Well, now wait a minute. It's not the whole roof. It's just the design work. Next year is going to be a little bit pricier,
more.
So
yeah,
I mean, actually build it.
Some capital expense there. Yeah, well, and we talked about this a little bit last week, the relative position of the city and county financially. The city has much lower debt as a percentage of its operating budget than the county does. And, not to be too much of a broken record on this, but the county hasn't raised property taxes in 25 years. The city has raised property taxes 3 times in that period. And there is just an undeniable difference that happens in your revenue streams when you periodically raise property taxes.
Yeah, there's inflation. Governments end up having to do that. They might have big changes they need to make, like the city's salary adjustments 2 years ago. That do need. They do need more revenue, and that's the way that cities and counties get more revenue. I mean, that's they can't go out and get more work. They rely on tax revenues.
I had when the city raised their property taxes a couple of years ago, I had a funny call from a county commissioner who was kind of grousing to me about the city tax increase, and was like, "What do you think about this?" And I said, "Well, I think it's what I expected." He was like, "What? Why would you expect a tax increase?" And I said, "Because the city raises its taxes every 7 or 8 years, and this is where we are." Like that's how their system is set up. And that was such a kind of foreign concept from the point of view of a county commissioner that it was sort of entertaining, because I was like, well, that's just what they do.
Yeah,
know?
And it is like 7 or 8 years. The city will push through a property tax increase, and that's just to and it's just kind of a natural thing because of inflation,
right? Well, and as we've talked about before, that property taxes, the way they're set up, we're not going to go into it right now, but property taxes, the way they're set up, do not keep pace with inflation, and this is the fundamental problem that governments that rely on property taxes a lot face, is that property tax revenues just don't keep up with inflation. They're basically designed so that they can't keep up with inflation. And so if you don't raise them, you don't keep up with inflation.
That's right.
Okay, well, on that note, hope you all have a great holiday weekend. Thanks, as always, to Lord Seth Barber for his production work here at Barbarian Productions. Our theme music is by Will Wright. And we will be back to talk to you next week.
Welcome to Compass Points, the weekly podcast for CompassKnox.com. CompassKnox.com is your best source for news and politics in Knoxville and Knox County. Your hosts today are Scott Barker and Jesse Mayshark, the founders of CompassKnox.com. You can find their daily in-depth coverage and subscribe at CompassKnox.com. The Compass Point podcast is brought to you in conjunction with Almost in Agreement. Almost an Agreement is a layman's attempt to get a handle on the workings in government and politics that we deal with every day. Check them out at almostanagreement.com or subscribe for free on your favorite podcast provider. If you'd like to learn more about the topics discussed on today's podcast, go to CompassKnox.com and subscribe for in-depth coverage and much more. And many thanks to William Wright for composing our theme song. Compass Points is a partnership of Barking Shark Media and Barbarian Productions, and recorded by Lord Seth A. Barber at Barbarian Studios, Knoxville, Tennessee.